The clinking of crystal champagne flutes stopped dead. A notoriously ruthless hedge fund CEO had just slammed a $100,000 check on the mahogany lid of a Steinway grand piano, publicly mocking the staff. Then, a 22-year-old waitress untied her apron, sat on the leather bench, and the whole room went silent. The air inside the private dining room of the Pierre Hotel on Fifth Avenue was thick with the scent of white truffles, expensive cigars, and the kind of wealth that insulated people from the real world. It was a Tuesday night, but for the executives of Hayes Capital, it was a victory lap. They had just finalized the hostile takeover of a massive biotech firm, a deal that resulted in the immediate termination of 3,000 employees, while padding the pockets of the men currently laughing over $1,000 bottles of Dom Perignon. At the center of the room, holding court like a modern-day emperor, was Damian Hayes. At 42, Damian possessed the sharp, predatory features of a man who was used to taking whatever he wanted. He wore a bespoke Brioni suit that draped flawlessly over his frame, and the heavy gold Patek Philippe Nautilus on his left wrist caught the dim ambient light every time he raised his glass. Damian was brilliant, arrogant, and notoriously cruel. He didn't just want to win. He needed others to know they had lost. Sophia Bennett was doing her best to become invisible. At 22, she was technically a contracted server for the hotel's elite events division, but tonight she felt more like a ghost navigating a graveyard of egos. Her black orthopedic work shoes ached against the polished marble floors as she gracefully weaved through the throngs of millionaires, balancing a heavy silver tray of empty oyster shells and discarded cocktail napkins. Sophia's life was a far cry from the opulent surroundings of the Pierre. She lived in a cramped, drafty apartment in Queens, working double shifts to pay off the crushing medical debt her father had accumulated before passing away from a severe stroke 2 years prior. Before the world had fallen apart, Sophia hadn't been a waitress. She had been a scholarship student at the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, widely considered one of the most grueling and prestigious conservatories in the world. She had been a prodigy, studying under a Russian master who swore she would be playing Carnegie Hall by her 21st birthday. Instead, she was clearing away the remnants of Damian Hayes's caviar. "Attention, attention, everyone!" Damian's voice boomed over the low hum of jazz playing from the hotel's sound system. He tapped a silver spoon against his champagne flute. The room quieted almost instantly. Sycophants and junior partners turned their eager faces toward their boss. Damian sauntered over to the corner of the room, where a meticulously restored 1928 Steinway & Sons Model D concert grand piano sat in the shadows. It was a magnificent instrument, 9 feet of polished ebony with ivory keys that had been played by some of the greatest maestros of the 20th century. "We talk a lot about excellence," Damian began, resting one hand casually on the closed lid of the piano. "In business, in the markets, there are predators, and there is prey. There are those who are born with the innate geometry of greatness in their minds, and there are those who are destined to simply serve." He cast a dismissive, sweeping glance around the room, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second on the catering staff lined up by the kitchen doors. Sophia kept her head down, her jaw clenching so tightly her teeth ached. "My mother forced me to play this infernal instrument for 15 years. Damian continued, a smirk playing on his lips. "She hired the first chair pianist of the New York Philharmonic to tutor me. I hated it. But because I am who I am, I mastered it. Because excellence doesn't care if you enjoy the process. It only cares if you have the pedigree to execute it." He sat down on the tufted leather bench, adjusted the tails of his suit jacket, and lifted his hands. Damian Hayes was not bluffing. The moment his fingers struck the keys, the room was filled with the furious, thunderous opening chords of Sergei Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. It was a piece designed to project power, and Damian played it with aggressive, mechanical perfection. His technique was flawless. His fingers flew across the keys with the precision of a calculator, striking every note with brutal accuracy. Yet to a trained ear, the performance was entirely devoid of soul. It lacked the nuanced phrasing, the subtle rubato, the emotional bleeding that Rachmaninoff demanded. It was not a piece of music, it was an exhibition of dominance. When he slammed the final resonant chords, the room erupted into thunderous applause. The junior partners cheered loudly, raising their glasses to their boss's undeniable talent. Damian stood offering a mock-exaggerated bow, soaking in the adulation. "Now," Damian said, wiping a microscopic bead of sweat from his forehead with a linen napkin handed to him by an assistant. "I am in a generous mood tonight. A gambling mood." He reached into the breast pocket of his suit, pulled out a sleek leather checkbook, and clicked a Montblanc pen. He scribbled for a moment, ripped the check from the binding, and slapped it face up on the piano's mahogany music desk. $100,000. Damian announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Payable to anyone in this room who can sit at this bench right now and outplay me. Anyone." The executives chuckled, shaking their heads. They knew better than to challenge Damian Hayes at anything, let alone something he had just proven he could dominate. "Come on." Damian taunted his eyes, scanning the room, clearly looking for a victim. "There are 50 people in this room. Surely one of you thinks you have what it takes. Or is it exactly as I said? Some are born to conquer, and the rest are just background noise." Sophia was standing less than 10 feet away, holding a fresh tray of champagne flutes. She was trying to remain as still as possible, waiting for the pompous display to end so she could finish her rotation and go home. But as Damian scanned the room, a slightly intoxicated vice president stepped backward to get out of the boss's line of sight and bumped squarely into Sophia's shoulder. The heavy silver tray tipped. Sophia scrambled to save it, but gravity won. 3 crystal champagne flutes slid off the edge and shattered violently against the marble floor. The sharp crash cut through the silence of the room like a gunshot. Every head in the private dining room turned toward her. Sophia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She immediately dropped to her knees, her face flushing crimson, and began gathering the broken shards of glass with trembling hands. "Well, well," Damian's voice drifted over, dripping with condescension. He slowly walked toward her, his polished leather shoes stopping inches from where she was kneeling. "It seems we have a volunteer." A few of the men in the room chuckled nervously. "I apologize, sir," Sophia said quietly, keeping her eyes glued to the floor as she picked up the glass. "It was an accident. I'll have this cleaned up immediately." "Look at you," Damian sneered, looking down at her plain black uniform, her hair tied back in a messy, functional bun. "Clumsy, uncoordinated. This is exactly what I was talking about. You people can't even carry a tray without failing, let alone comprehend the complexities of true artistry." He looked back at his audience playing to the crowd. "I bet you haven't touched an instrument in your life, sweetheart. Unless you count ringing up a cash register." The cruelty in his voice was palpable. It wasn't just a joke. It was a targeted effort to humiliate someone who had no power to defend herself. The catering manager, a nervous man named Richard, rushed out from the kitchen looking terrified. "Mr. Hayes, I am so sorry," the manager stammered. "She'll be sent home immediately. Please excuse the disruption." Sophia stopped gathering the glass. The words hung in the air, "sent home immediately." That meant she would lose her shift pay. It meant she wouldn't be able to cover the final installment of her father's hospital bills this month. The sheer injustice of it, all the staggering wealth in the room, the unearned arrogance of the man standing above her, and the dismissal of her livelihood snapped something deep inside her. 3 years of repressed grief, 3 years of denying the music that used to be her entire world boiled up into her throat. Sophia slowly stood up. She wiped her hands on the small towel tucked into her apron. She didn't look at her manager. She looked directly into Damian Hayes's eyes. "I'll take the bet," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the room, it carried perfectly. Damian blinked, genuinely taken aback for a fraction of a second, before a cruel, genuine smile spread across his face. "Excuse me. The $100,000? Sophia said, her voice steadying. She stepped over the broken glass, closing the distance between herself and the billionaire. "You said anyone in the room. I'll take the bet." The room erupted into murmurs. Several guests pulled out their smartphones, the glow of recording screens illuminating their amused faces. This was prime entertainment. The untouchable hedge fund king about to publicly humiliate a rebellious waitress. "Sophia, what are you doing?" the catering manager hissed, grabbing her arm. "Apologize and get back to the kitchen." Sophia gently but firmly pulled her arm out of his grasp. He made an open wager. "I'm accepting." Damian laughed aloud, a sharp, barking sound. "You're serious? The help wants to play." He gestured expansively toward the Steinway. "By all means, sweetheart. But let's make it interesting. If you lose, and you will lose, you don't just walk away. You stand in the center of this room, you look at my colleagues, and you loudly admit that you are exactly what I said. You are incompetent, uncultured, and born to serve." Sophia didn't flinch. "And when I win, the check clears tomorrow." Damian stepped aside, waving his hand toward the piano like a matador inviting the bull. "The floor is yours." Sophia walked toward the grand piano. With every step, the heavy, oppressive reality of her current life seemed to shed. She wasn't a waitress dodging hands and cleaning up caviar anymore. The smell of the hotel faded, replaced in her memory by the scent of lemon polish and old paper from the practice rooms at the Curtis Institute. She reached the bench. She didn't sit down immediately. Instead, she reached behind her back and untied the knot of her black catering apron, letting it slide off her shoulders and fall to the floor. She sat on the leather bench. The murmurs in the room grew louder. "Is she actually going to do it? This is going to be a disaster. Get a good angle of Hayes's face when she messes up." Sophia ignored them. She reached forward and made a minute adjustment to the height of the bench, a habit drilled into her by her old Russian instructor. She placed her feet on the brass pedals, feeling the familiar, reassuring resistance of the metal. She looked at the keys. She hadn't touched a real concert grand in nearly 36 months. Her hands were calloused from carrying trays and washing dishes in scalding water, no longer the perfectly manicured hands of a conservatory prodigy. Damian crossed his arms, leaning against a nearby pillar. "Whenever you're ready, maestro. Let's hear chopsticks." Sophia took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and let the noise of the room completely vanish. She didn't need to look at the keys to know where they were. They were mapped into the very syntax of her brain. She didn't choose a bombastic, aggressive piece to counter Damian's Rachmaninoff. She didn't need to bash the keys to prove her dominance. She needed to expose his lack of artistry. She chose Frédéric Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. When Sophia's fingers finally descended upon the keys, she didn't strike them. She commanded them. The opening, a heavy, questioning Neapolitan chord rolled out of the Steinway, with a profound, echoing sadness that instantly arrested the air in the room. It wasn't just played correctly. It was played with a devastating, raw, emotional weight that only someone who had known profound loss could conjure. The mocking smiles on the faces of the executives instantly vanished. Phones that were being held up to record a joke slowly lowered. Damian Hayes's arms uncrossed, his posture stiffening as the first haunting melodic line began to weave through the silence of the room. The waitress had vanished. The maestro had returned. The music did not merely fill the private dining room. It consumed it. Chopin's Ballad, Number 1 in G minor, is not a piece one can simply muscle through with technical proficiency. It is a sprawling, demanding narrative of a composition oscillating wildly between delicate weeping whispers and furious, tempestuous roars. It requires the performer to possess an intricate understanding of human suffering and triumph. Sophia Bennett did not just understand it. She was currently living it. Her calloused fingers, though out of practice, possessed a muscle memory forged in the fires of 10,000 hours of relentless rehearsal at the Curtis Institute. As the tempo accelerated into the animato section, her hands became a blur of astonishing precision. She navigated the treacherous leaps and lightning-fast runs with a terrifying, effortless grace. The 1928 Steinway, which had sounded stiff and mechanical under Damian's heavy-handed assault, suddenly sang. It wailed, it breathed. The executives of Hayes Capital stood frozen. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the electric, undeniable presence of absolute genius. Men who spent their lives quantifying value and analyzing data found themselves entirely unable to process the sheer unquantifiable beauty happening before their eyes. The vice president who had bumped into Sophia was holding a fresh glass of scotch. It was tilted at a dangerous angle, the amber liquid threatening to spill onto the marble, but he didn't even notice. Damian Hayes felt the color drain from his face. The smug, predatory grin that had defined his features just moments before had completely vanished, replaced by a tight, rigid mask of disbelief. He was a man who understood leverage power and hierarchy. In his worldview, a 22-year-old waitress in cheap orthopedic shoes could not possibly possess a skill that dwarfed his own. Yet with every complex arpeggio and devastating chord progression, she was dismantling his ego brick by brick in front of his entire firm. As Sophia approached the iconic explosive coda, a notoriously brutal section, known for its punishing demands on the pianist's stamina and accuracy, she didn't shy away. She leaned into the keys, her body swaying with the ferocious rhythm. The chords crashed through the room like thunderclaps, perfectly voiced, fiercely passionate, and entirely flawless. With a breathtaking downward sweep, she struck the final resonant G minor chords. She lifted her hands from the keys, letting them hover in the air for a fraction of a second before lowering them to her lap. She kept her back perfectly straight, staring at the polished mahogany nameplate of the piano. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, ringing quiet, far profounder than the silence that had preceded her playing. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. They were too stunned to remember the social protocols of a performance. Finally, the clatter of a silver fork dropping onto a porcelain plate shattered the spell. Murmurs erupted, sweeping through the room like a sudden wind. The cell phones that had been recording the anticipated humiliation were now capturing something entirely different, a viral sensation in the making. Damian pushed himself off the pillar he had been leaning against. His face was flushed with a dangerous, volatile mix of embarrassment and rage. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles fluttered visibly beneath his skin. He walked slowly toward the piano, his eyes locked onto Sophia. A parlor trick, Damian said, his voice low, lacking its previous booming confidence. A party piece. Anyone can spend a decade drilling a single Chopin ballad into their muscle memory to impress their friends. The room quieted down, the executives watching the tense exchange. The terms of the bet were clear, and everyone knew it. She had outplayed him. But Damian Hayes did not lose gracefully. You played one piece. Damian continued, his voice rising, trying to reclaim his authority. That doesn't prove mastery. It proves you have a good memory. If you want $100,000 of my money, you don't get to dictate the terms with a rehearsed performance. Sophia slowly turned her head to look at him. Her expression was entirely unreadable. You said, and I quote, "Anyone who can sit at this bench right now and outplay me." I believe I just did. I am the judge of that, Damian snapped, slamming his hand flat against the lid of the piano, causing the strings inside to vibrate with a low, dissonant hum. And I say it was a fluke, a trick. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, swiping aggressively across the screen. You want to prove you're a musician? Let's see you sight read. Real artists can play what is put in front of them. He pulled up a digital sheet music file, slammed his phone onto the music stand of the Steinway, and glared at her. Play that. Perfectly. Right now. If you can even read it. Several junior partners exchanged uncomfortable glances. The cruelty was no longer entertaining. It was desperate. Sophia leaned forward and looked at the glowing screen. The piece was Franz Liszt's Feux Follets, Will-o'-the-Wisp, the fifth of his transcendental etudes. It is widely considered one of the most fiendishly difficult pieces ever written for the piano, an unrelenting barrage of double notes, rapid leaps, and complex polyrhythms designed to break the spirit of even seasoned professionals. To sight read it was considered an impossible feat. Sophia looked at the screen, then slowly looked up at Damian. You want me to sight read Feux Follets off a 5-inch screen? Damian smiled, a nasty, triumphant sneer returning to his lips. What's the matter? Can't read the notes? Or do you finally admit you're out of your depth, sweetheart? Before Sophia could respond, a voice cut through the tension. It wasn't loud, but it possessed an immense, undeniable gravity. She doesn't need to read it. From the back of the room, a man stepped out of the shadows. He was in his late 60s, leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane. He wore a simple, unostentatious grey suit, standing in stark contrast to the flashy tailored Brioni and Tom Ford suits worn by the hedge fund executives. He had been a silent observer in the corner booth all evening, a VIP guest whose identity had been whispered about, but never confirmed by the junior staff. Damian's arrogant sneer faltered. Mr. Olson, I'm sorry, we're just having a bit of fun here. The older man ignored the billionaire. He walked slowly across the marble floor, the rhythmic tap of his cane echoing in the quiet room. He stopped a few feet from the piano, his sharp, intelligent eyes fixed squarely on Sophia. It was Garrick Olson, the legendary American classical pianist, the first American to win first prize in the International Chopin Piano Competition, and one of the most respected figures in the global classical music community. Damian had invited him as a token of high culture, hoping to persuade the maestro to join the board of a new philanthropic foundation Hayes Capital was launching for tax purposes. Olson looked at Sophia, his eyes traveling over her tired face, her messy bun and the cheap black uniform. I was wondering where you disappeared to, Olson said softly, his voice echoing with genuine sorrow. Leon looked for you, you know. Up until the very week he passed. A collective gasp swept through the room. Olson was referring to the late Leon Fleischer, one of the greatest piano pedagogues of the 20th century. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled, not from nerves, but from the sudden overwhelming weight of the past crashing into her present. My father got sick, Mr. Olson, she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time that evening. I had to leave Curtis. I had to work. Olson nodded slowly, understanding the tragedy in an instant. He turned his attention to the billionaire hedge fund manager. Mr. Hayes, Olson said, his tone icy and cutting. You asked her to sight-read list. What you do not realize is that 4 years ago, I sat on the jury of the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition. Miss Bennett here was the youngest competitor in the field. She didn't just play Feux Follets, she performed it with a level of clarity and technical brilliance that made the jury weep. She was the absolute favorite to win before she was forced to withdraw. The color completely drained from Damian's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and realized there was no safety net. Furthermore, Olsen continued his voice, rising, projecting across the room, so every single executive could hear him clearly. Your rendition of Rachmaninoff earlier was frankly an embarrassment. You butchered the tempo your peddling was muddy, and your phrasing lacked any semblance of emotional intelligence. It was the playing of a brute. Miss Bennett did not just outplay you. She humiliated you. She is a master. You are merely a typist. The silence in the private dining room was now deafening. Nobody dared to breathe. The untouchable king of Hayes Capital had just been intellectually and artistically dismantled by a cultural titan. Olsen pointed his cane at the $100,000 check resting on the mahogany music desk. Pay the girl, Mr. Hayes, before I make a phone call to the art sections of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal detailing the profound ignorance of a man who claims to champion the arts. Damian Hayes was trapped. His ego was entirely shattered. His authority in front of his firm dissolved in a matter of minutes. His hand shook violently as he reached forward, picked up the Mont Blanc pen he had left on the piano, and officially signed his name at the bottom of the check. He didn't hand it to her. He slid it across the polished wood, refusing to make eye contact. Sophia picked up the slip of paper. $100,000. It was enough to wipe out the remaining medical debt. It was enough to buy back her father's mortgaged house. It was enough to buy her life back. She stood up from the bench. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She looked down at the billionaire who was staring at his expensive shoes. The geometry of greatness isn't born in a bank account, Mr. Hayes, Sophia said, quietly, echoing his earlier arrogant speech. It's born in the work. You should try it sometime. She picked up her discarded apron from the floor, folded it neatly, and set it on the closed lid of the piano. Without another word, she walked past the stunned executives, past her terrified catering manager, and out the double doors of the private dining room, leaving the billionaires in total devastating silence. What an absolute masterclass in dealing with arrogance. Sophia proved that true talent and grace will always outshine unearned ego, leaving a billionaire completely speechless in front of his own firm. If you loved this incredible story of a waitress turning the tables on a ruthless CEO, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a dose of inspiration, and subscribe for more dramatic, real-life stories.